Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. It is really good to be with all of you here today. And today's topic is about sustainable governance and leadership practices through effective task and relationship management. So this is obviously a very important topic simply because for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been talking about sustainable development goals or SDGs. And since climate control and conference, most universities have had this agenda. So today we'll be talking about that agenda as well, but more specifically, we'll try to define what is sustainability, what is leadership, and what is the implication for you and I in terms of morality, ethics, and removal of corruption, and how basically these three elements sort of fit together. So that's the agenda for today. As you know, the population is growing in many developing nations, including Afghanistan, in others around the globe. However, while the population is growing, unfortunately, sometimes some of our common practices have stayed the way they were 100 years ago, 15 years ago. And in the case of Afghanistan, unfortunately, we've been mired in 40 years of war. And that mindset is very negative because it causes too much tension and conflict among people. At the same time, we're seeing resources depleting, basically. So we have shortage of food, warming of climate, we have all kinds of climate disasters and deforestation that is taking place, besides the conflicts and war at the social level. And now, especially this year, with regards to COVID-19 pandemic, we know that we're living in an interdependent world. Therefore, we need to think of the globe as one world without any man-made borders being relevant for the well-being of humanity. So what happens in China, in Europe, in US, seems to have obviously the same interdependent impact in the rest of the globe. So we cannot stop the virus in one location, one nation, and get rid of it. Unfortunately, it has impacted the lives of everybody economically, environmentally, and socially around the globe. So we need sustainable development goals and also leaders who can actually effectively govern with equity for all, regardless of whether a person or a family or a nation is rich or poor. Global leaders to basically step up and treat everyone with equity. And we'll discuss basically what I mean by equity and good governance here at the latter part of my presentation. So the Sustainable Development Goals are also known as global goals. They were adopted by the United Nations member states back in 2015. And I was able to participate at one of the conferences actually in Lahore, Pakistan about climate control and sustainability at the ICMR conference. We had the ambassadors from Italy, from France, and others participating as well. So these sustainable development goals are universal call to action to end poverty, to protect our planet, and to ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity over the coming decades. So the 17 SDGs are somewhat integrated. In other words, they're holistically, one seems to impact the other. The more we can obviously do in all of these 17 areas, the better off our society will be. In other words, we're trying to solve the world's toughest challenges over the next decade or two. In the case of Afghanistan, unfortunately, because we've been impacted so badly over the last 40 years, we might need a little bit more time, but this is where the global community comes in, where they have to invest more in Afghanistan, the current workforce, and the future generation in order for Afghanistan to have a speedy recovery and obviously do better. All these developments must be balanced in terms of social, economic, and environmental sustainability. The goal here is to pledge to leave no one behind. So countries should commit to fast-track progress for the poorest or most disadvantaged. In this case, as we can see, Afghanistan, unfortunately, is one of the poorest nations in the world because of years of fighting and civil unrest. So therefore, the global community has this obligation to help out. In this case, obviously, the poorest country, which happens to be Afghanistan, or Afghanistan happens to be one of them. So these SDGs are designed to bring the world to several life-changing zeros, including zero poverty. And obviously, that's what our goal is for the young children, not just in Afghanistan, but throughout the world, to be able to have access to food and also educational opportunities in all corners of the cities and states. Everyone is needed to reach these ambitious targets. The creativity, the know-how, the technology, and the financial resources from all of society is necessary to achieve the goal in every context. The goal of SDGs is to enable people's understanding of the world in fundamentally new ways, and also to behave for the long-term interest of everyone in our communities throughout our nations. So the Sustainable Development Goals call for members of each community to work jointly together to sort of bridge the multifaceted differences and conflicts that exist in our day-to-day lives in our nations. To effectively implement the SDGs for the long-term interest of the public requires that all relevant stakeholders, including government, business, in civil society, play a collective role in the communities where we reside and bring about the economic growth, social development, as well as conservation of the environment. So this collective role of all stakeholders should include a common understanding of the ethical base for the new social order, for the long-term interest of everyone to be accomplished through appropriate goals. So in this case, I'm emphasizing obviously a balance of the three elements here, the social, economic, environmental, and we're emphasizing long-term interest because we don't want short-term profit maximization only for the rich and for the powerful. We want this to be balanced and obviously reach the poorest and the most disadvantaged first. The SDG agenda for 2030 does include the interdependence of all three dimensions. What is interesting is that while we do talk about the economic and environmental development of SDGs, oftentimes we don't pay enough attention to the social element. So the social element, less attention, maybe because it is a little bit more difficult to attain and to measure and to implement. So we need to focus on the social dimension, which includes good governance, leadership, and obviously having high ethical standards that can be enforced for the social cohesion of everyone in society. And more specifically, I think in Afghanistan, we need this even more. Societal problems tend to arise and cause sustained conflicts when too many individuals to follow their own individual profit motive and profit maximization goal for their immediate satisfaction, rather than actually looking at the long-term overall community's best interest. In Afghanistan, we need obviously to collective action trap. So we know that no single person or group can solve the prolonged and widespread civil war, unrest, and corruption that everybody's facing in Afghanistan now, and also obviously over the past 4 decades. So for example, domestic, national, and international partnerships for collective actions can actually result in specific agreed upon institutional arrangements, which actually mandate that there be regular and continuous oversight of the public sector to monitor and to encourage good governance for the long-term interest of everyone in Afghanistan and throughout the globe. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development does mention what good governance is. And they say good governance is characterized by participation, by transparency, by accountability, by rule of law, in effectiveness, as well as equity in this case. And also the International Monetary Fund states that good governance refers to the management of government in such a manner that is essentially free of abuse and corruption, and with due regard for the rule of law. So the rule of law and the social dimension of the SDGs obviously becomes important here. So we can summarize that governance must consist of transparency, accountability, inclusion, equity, as well as responsibility, good management, leadership, and participation of all stakeholders in the decisions and implementation of the goals, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. In the private sector, you see that there are a lot of competitive challenges that they must face. And if they do face these challenges effectively, they'll have a competitive advantage as well. And so sustainability is very important for the private sector as well. So is globalization and effective use of technology. So sustainability is defined as our ability at the organizational level to effectively and to efficiently manage the core economic responsibilities while also respecting our environment and being accountable to all the stakeholders in a transparent manner. So in this case, the most important stakeholder perhaps is the community, especially the people living in those communities, as well as the government in the international community. And the United Nations said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think this is a good way of looking at sustainable development, regardless of where we operate, public sector or private sector. We need sustainable decision-making, which requires that all professionals focus on having a very efficient process that eliminates any waste in the production process. So this model about sustainable leadership talks about a comprehensive model where we look at the law, we look at ethics and morality, as well as the social and environmental dimensions in order to achieve sustainable leadership. If we don't do this, unfortunately, this problem of waste will continue. So if you look at the US alone, about 2.5 million plastic bottles are thrown away every single hour. Every single hour. So imagine how many plastic bottles were thrown away per day, per year. And obviously all countries are similar in terms of creating plastic waste in our environment. Every year, the US generates over 243 million tons of solid waste. Every year, about 30 to 40% of the food produced worldwide is wasted. And we also see that waste is entering rivers, groundwater, and oceans, thereby it is poisoning the available resources, especially the natural resources. If you look at the agricultural environment of Afghanistan, unfortunately, if our water is poisoned, that means we don't get to grow apples, we don't get to grow wheat, corn, and all the other nutrients that Afghans need to produce for their family members. And even the Department of Defense actually in the United States said that climate is actually an urgent threat. The climate change is an urgent threat and growing threat to our national security that will aggravate poverty, social tensions, ineffectual leadership, weak political institutions, and stability around the globe. So you can see even the US Department of Defense is saying that climate change is a huge national security for them. Stormwater drains capture rainwater on roads and move it into canals and eventually bigger rivers and the ocean. This means antifreeze, gasoline, and even other toxins from cars go into our neighborhoods and oceans. If you look at the existence of how many cars actually exist in cobble streets alone, all of this gas, unfortunately, creates pollutants into the environment, which makes it very difficult for people to breathe and stay healthy. Water scarcity affects about 40% of people in the world and is projected to increase. So that is sad because both Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and also our other neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan, unfortunately, and India, they are having the same thing with water deficiency. So we're using about 25% more natural resources than our planet can sustain. So this is not sustainable. In other words, we need to change course. The good news is, countries like Afghanistan, for example, we use more natural resources, therefore we're not polluting the environment at the same rate as European and North American countries. So that's why the responsibility falls in the powerful and the rich countries to help the poor countries like Afghanistan to fight, obviously, this climate control so we can be more sustainable. About 800 million people live in extreme poverty and suffer from hunger every single day. That's a huge number of people that we need to assist. Global emissions in carbon dioxide have increased over 50% since just 1990. It is rising so fast to where many companies, unfortunately, are falsifying their data. If you look at the Volkswagen emissions scandal, which I wrote an article about when we did some research, they willfully falsified data to make it look like they were actually in compliance with the American standards, but they were not. So they paid something like billions of dollars to the American government. But in places like Afghanistan, where the government is not always able to enforce all of these standards, obviously these global companies are taking advantage of that situation and polluting the environment even more. So we can prevent the worsening impact of climate change by reducing it, by combating it, by stopping it, and by adapting to it, we can start by focusing on sustainability in everything that we do. You see, the ambassador of France, Ambassador Durance, when we were at the conference in 2015, she mentioned that a report by Carbon Disclosure Project shows that businesses which actively take into account the issue of climate or sustainability, they tend to have higher return on investment than those that do not. And this 18% higher return on investment is very good for the private sector. So therefore, there's an economic benefit for private sector to actually take into consideration. And authors have written that it is critical for modern companies and leaders to grow profit in a responsible, ethical, and sustainable manner. So if you look at Mohammed O'Toole in Lawler's book in 2015, they talk about corporate stewardship and how we all need to be stewards of the environment. And the way forward seems to be that we need to educate our students, our consumers in the workforce on the necessity of actually being sustainable, as well as the benefits of sustainability in the economic, in the environmental, as well as the social dimensions. So we have a very beautiful scenery in Afghanistan throughout all of the provinces. So we need to keep it clean and we need to keep it green. Otherwise, unfortunately, our own environment means we're hurting the future generation and the health of our current workforce and future workforce in Afghanistan. And as you can see here, the Italian ambassador also at the ICMR conference mentioned that it is a moral obligation to protect the future of our children. Creatively to develop green standards in every element of our operation, in everything we do, both in government as well as in the private sector. The good news is the new generation, or Generation Z actually, they seem to be in demanding more sustainability-oriented lifestyles and behaviors. So the younger generation is focused on sustainability in the economic and the environmental, as well as the social dimension, and we need to support them with that, or the right tools so they can keep the environment clean and obviously be in alignment with the 2030 goals. By acting locally or even in our own interest, each country actually can contribute significantly to the solution of global challenge. We need to act locally in order to solve the global challenges. So in Afghanistan, we need problems for our issues or challenges as Afghanis, but we need the help of the international community. So we need to reduce waste, we need to reuse some of the material, we need to recycle, we need to renew, and also we need to respect our environment. Today's citizens expect all leaders from around the world to find and implement solutions or to mitigate and adapt to climate change through sustainable solutions in equitable procedures. So again, equity comes in to play here. We need to go beyond equality to equity, which is more sustainable for society. So if you're looking at this picture, which one seems to be more fair? If we go about equality, obviously here you got three people with three different sizes. So if we provide them equal resources, that means this little young man is still going to suffer. So we need to focus on equity. Equity basically means we distribute resources fairly to the rich and the poor nations according to their needs. In the case of Afghanistan and other poor countries, the global community needs to help out a lot more. So this way we can use the global resources effectively to have a better world by 2030 and hopefully a little bit quicker. The implication here is that inequity can lead to the poor getting poorer and the rich getting richer, along with disappointments, hatred, and conflict and prolonged violence, which are not sustainable. We don't want these little children, for example, to be fatherless and motherless or impacted by all the war and violence and the bombs that unfortunately they've been experiencing. So we need to support the poorest first and obviously move toward equity. A couple of days ago, I noticed that the American Embassy in Afghanistan posted this statement from Jane Addams on their website. They mentioned that true peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. the presence of justice for equity, obviously for all, and this is in alignment with SDGs that are mentioned for the year 2030. So we need to change our paradigms from the past thinking of equality to the present thinking of equity as well as sustainability in all of our decisions and everything that we decide, everything we do publicly and privately. This is where we need leadership. Leadership basically means influencing others to facilitate the attainment of objectives that are actually equitable as well as sustainable. So we need private sector leaders as well as public sector leaders. And as my mentor, Dr. Paul Hersey, used to say, that effective leadership is adapting your behavior to the performance needs of the people who are being influenced. So whether you're working in the government or private sector, it doesn't matter. The goal here is for us to be good leaders and adapt our styles of leadership according to the needs of the situation. Obviously in Afghanistan, it means educating education for everyone throughout the provinces. There are two elements of leadership I think we need to keep in mind. So the task orientation or edaara kaardan, or relationship orientation, otherwise guzaara kaardan. Sometimes, as we can see in Afghanistan, we focus too much on the guzaara orientation. So we try to basically respect relationships and family, but sometimes we do that at a cost of management or edaara kaardan. So we need to have a balance of the two based on what is needed the most at a given time. We need both task orientation as well as relationship orientation in a balanced manner. So I think the balance is the key here to effective leadership for rahbariyat, or our rahbars need to obviously consider both sides of this and do this in a balanced manner, while also focusing on efficiency, which basically means having good management skills. If we do this in a proper way, a balanced way, that means we can explain, we can coach, and we can mentor to complete the jobs that are needed in order to make Afghanistan just as good as the rest of the world and get the resources we need from the international community to make the lives of the poorest people in Afghanistan maybe a little bit better by the 2030 year. So leadership or rahbariyat is about knowing the way, it's about showing the way, and it's about going the way. Unfortunately, from what I hear, in many cases, especially in Afghanistan, we have people in positions of power that unfortunately does not know the way because they were promoted because of connection or wasita. They didn't have the right qualifications. So if we people that do not have the right qualification, the jobs, that means they're not going to know the way. They cannot show us the way, and certainly they will not be going the way. So this is why qualification in education are so important, to make sure everybody knows what they're doing in the professions of their employment. So good leaders, managers are situational, and they continue their education using technology. In today's environment, some of the best universities around the world during this COVID-19 situation, they have adapted. They're using technology very effectively. So learning and teaching is actually sustaining flexibility and being open-minded while adapting to the modern realities of life. So educators and students are using technology to continue their programs, which is very good. And this is also good to see that Kaardan University is making various sessions available using technology like Zoom or other online platforms and Facebook live streaming to help educate students and to pass on knowledge. So whether we are using instructor-led training or virtual instructor-led training or e-learning or video learning, all of these are different ways that we can actually adapt to continue educating all of our young children and current workforce in Afghanistan, despite the difficulties. Good leaders need to avoid mismanagement by listening properly, by learning the facts about a given situation, and also by leading based on what they learn, so that leadership can be sustainable over time. By the way, think about if you can recognize where I'm sitting on this picture. Some of you might know and recognize this, but the question here is, for an average sized body, do I look comfortable here? Think about if I'm watching soccer game or football game, and I sit there for 2 to 3 hours to cheer my team. I don't really look very comfortable in these seats. It seems like this is built for young children or basically somebody made a mistake and did not obviously design this properly. Perhaps nobody spoke up when this was being built. So if you have thousands of seats like this, that's a huge mismanagement. Obviously, this is the Afghan National Stadium, where many of these seats cannot be used by adults. Obviously, they can be used by children, but adults obviously don't feel comfortable in this environment. So we need to encourage everybody to participate in the decision-making so we can avoid these types of mistakes and use the resources or the limited resources that we have in Afghanistan effectively, so we can be more sustainable and compete effectively with the global community. So we need leaders who can be efficient and leaders who can be effective. So we need those who are task-oriented and those who are relationship-oriented, those who know about guzaara kaardan as well as edaara kaardan. So not everybody may be very good at this, but there's a small percentage of leaders who are basically in this area where they can adjust either one way or the other way to be effective leaders, not just obviously in the private sector, but in the public sector as well. The Japanese proverb says that if you understand everything, you must be misinformed. I think in Asia, we have to do a lot more for everybody that we serve. We need to be continuous learners. In today's environment, knowledge doubles every 2 years. So we need to educate ourselves on a regular basis. Albert Einstein mentioned that the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. So we need to think differently and out of the box to solve today's problems. And one of the main problems, as most of you know, is actually perception of ethics in Afghanistan. So if you look at the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International, Afghanistan is usually ranked on the bottom with regards to how ethical we are being perceived as a culture. So if you look at Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, even Myanmar and Somalia, we all fall on the bottom of the 190 to 200 countries that are rated almost every single year. So that was 2010 data. In 2011, we didn't change that much. If you look at the data from actually 2002, 2003, we fall in the same area. We fall in the bottom of the countries. The best countries in terms of highly clean or ethical environment for business seems to be New Zealand, Sweden, Singapore, Netherlands, Australia, in Canada and Germany. So the US is actually not very high either. But in Afghanistan, we need to do a lot more to move this forward. If you look at their 2019 data, this shows the darkest is basically highly corrupt cultures, and the lightest is very clean environment or highly ethical environment. If you look at Afghanistan here, we're actually in the very dark red. So even in 2019, we have not changed that much the perception of the ethical perception in the international environment. We need to do more. If you look at this data again, all the way from 2011 to 2019, we're ranking on the bottom percentages of countries when it comes to being perceived as ethical culture. So we need to do more in the public sector as well as private sector. We need to remove bureaucracy and red tape. My experience the last 3 years in Afghanistan was to basically do an adoption of an orphan named Noman, and I hired this lawyer. So the lawyer helped me to basically overcome some of the red tape, but unfortunately after 3 years, too many people wanted corruption, too many people wanted bribery, too many people wanted rishwat-khori, and the job didn't get done. So after 3 years, basically we gave up because we couldn't get it done. Here's an orphan that needs a family that we got visa in the US, but we needed wasiqa in Afghanistan. And basically did not cooperate as much, so the red tape was too large. So it took 3 years, and after 3 years, we still didn't get it done. So we withdrew the application, and unfortunately, we cannot help little Noman in Afghanistan. So this unnecessary bureaucratic red tape is not sustainable, yet it seems to be the normal, unethical, and illegal exercise of power to collect bribes, which is practiced a little bit too often in many cities around Afghanistan, unfortunately. And this discourages the international community as well as the Afghan entrepreneurs to continue doing business. It also means that the rich gets richer but the poor stays poorer because they cannot pay these bribes, which is not good. Now, corruption, unfortunately, is everywhere. So you look at this American attaché basically being in the Vietnamese embassy. He was charging basically $20,000 to about $70,000 per visa to come to the United States. So eventually the American law basically caught up with him. So he ended up going to jail. They caught him. And unfortunately, too many people were obviously treated unfairly by one government official, and that is the American official in Vietnam. So we don't want the foreigners or Afghanis in Afghanistan to be corrupt. We need to do more education, which is more sustainable. And what is interesting is if you look at the US Embassy's mission in Thailand, they focus on integrity, unity, creativity, and responsibility. So in responsibility, they say, do your best for yourself, for your team, and for your community. This is where the collective community is important. In other words, we need to have the long-term best interest of the collective community in order to do better today, tomorrow, and by the year 2030. We need good governance and sustainability. We must say no to any form of corruption, including bribery. And the best weapon to fight corruption is a pen or a pencil with a book through continuous education, continuous training. I proposed this model in 2011 in our book called Bakshish or Bribe, which was published here in the US. But we basically said we need to create awareness and also enforcement policies. We need to educate, we need to be transparent, we need to monitor and audit, we need to discipline properly those who are in violation of these laws. This model actually is a very practical model to help the environment become more ethical. We need to prevent, obviously, corruption. Prevention is always better than asking for forgiveness. So this prevention requires education of everyone in the country or in the society. We need to educate ourselves and respect ourselves. We need to have higher standards for ourselves. We need to respect the community. We need to respect life. We need to respect the future. And we need to respect the environment. These are the global, personal, as well as universal ethics that everybody should learn and be aligned with. Do what you expect of others because people are likely to follow the actions that they observe of their respected leaders, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. So you and I need to be the ethical role models that we expect of everybody else. What is interesting is that sometimes we might be educating our students, but nothing may change. But the interesting story of the Chinese bamboo story makes a good point. When a Chinese bamboo tree is planted into the ground and watered effectively and nourished, its growth is all underground for the first 4 years. But in the 5th year, in 3 to 4 weeks, it grows over 6 feet tall. In other words, actually, it gets to about 90 feet almost in that end of that 5th year. So all of the growth, the first 4 years is underground, but in the 5th year, it's all basically visible. So we need to continue to work hard, even if we don't see immediate change. We know that education works and it will bring positive changes in the years to come. In summary, I would like to say that all of you and I, as sustainable leaders, collectively, we need to operationalize the 5 R's in every aspect of our work in consumption. We need to reduce, we need to reuse, we need to recycle, we need to renew, and we need to respect the environment and the law in the communities where we operate. So be aware of ethical concerns, fill the needs of your destiny, achieve ihsan. As you know, in ihsan, in Afghanistan or in Islam, we say ihsan is achieving the highest level of character for yourself in the highest level of morality, which is a continuous process. So we need to be good role models, and we need to know that people will appreciate it both locally, nationally, in Afghanistan, as well as internationally around the globe. We need to be ethical. That is my recommendation for all of us. And that's why we say that being ethical is the only sustainable element of leadership, and we need to continue that part. So that is basically a little bit of reflection. Now we can open it for discussion, question, or any comments that you may have.
Yes, if anybody wants to ask a question, please go for the question.
I was talking about the Cooperation Perception Index 2019, whether the other countries are also available in Afghanistan or also there.
Right. And I've been doing research actually on ethics since 1993 when I was a master's student and then a doctoral student. So my research is in the area of ethical maturity and how countries are being perceived. So Transparency International has been doing actually that research every single year, but unfortunately Afghanistan, they couldn't collect data some years because of the war, so they couldn't collect the data. But for most years, since 2001, they've had data on their website. So I looked at their website actually last week as I was finalizing the latest data. So I looked at the latest data, which they have 2019. Still, unfortunately, being looked at as one of the worst places to do business. In other words, our business sector as well as our government sector is very corrupt. In other words, you cannot get much work done without bribing somebody or without giving rishwat or without having wasita. And so there's about 180 to 190 countries that they rate every single year. Afghanistan, unfortunately, usually ranked 179, 180, 181. So we're sort of one of the last countries to be as having a good environment for ethics. And one of the things I noticed when I spoke with Dr. Ashraf Ghani back in 2005, when we were at Kabul University, he did emphasize that education was actually the only way to remove this corruption. So this is the data actually from 2019. You see, from 2011 to 2019, Afghanistan has not moved that much, although in 2015, 16, we did move a few points up, but not too much. So we're still, unfortunately, looked at as being highly corrupt environment for business. Much of this has to do with educating both our managers as well as our young students now to expect more. The good news is Afghanistan, Afghanis who are young, they're also those who are considered the Generation Z. So they are much more socially conscious. They expect much more from the government as well as the business sector. So I think the only solution is to provide training through universities, training for current managers, and also to make our decision-making more transparent at all levels. And I like, for example, the Afghan Constitution back in 2004, 2005, they had mentioned that every person who selected a minister or at a high level, a deputy minister and so on, they need to have a disclosure of their assets. So that's good, that's being transparent. If we practice that, that's good. But if we don't practice it, unfortunately, then people outside still will see the Afghan culture as very corrupt, even though corruption may not exist, but nonetheless, the perception will be there. So we need to do more in order to increase our ability to be seen as a more mature or ethical culture. This way, the international community invests more. So for example, European companies and American companies, when they want to expand abroad, they want to go to Afghanistan, they say, should we invest $2 million or $10 million in Afghanistan, or should we do it in Tajikistan? Chances are when they look at the CPI or Ethical Maturity Index, they'll say we need to go to Tajikistan because it's more ethically mature, or they invest in Dubai because it's close to Afghanistan, but they don't invest in Afghanistan, which means our people do not obviously get the benefit of additional jobs. The government does not benefit from those additional taxes that could be basically producing much more revenue for the Afghan government and also for employment purposes for young people. So unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why so many of our young people in Afghanistan, they graduate with bachelor degrees or high school, but they don't get jobs. And they end up going to Pakistan, to Iran, or to Europe in order to work, obviously, in labor jobs in foreign countries, but they're well educated. So they can stay in Afghanistan if we can attract more international community to come and invest, obviously, in Afghanistan, as opposed to producing it in China or in Dubai or in Tajikistan or Pakistan, and then delivering those goods into Afghanistan. So we need to do more to obviously bring them into Afghanistan so we can increase our employment and economic element as well.
Doctor, last time we met and you also talked about your book by the name of Bakhshish. If you go to the religious point of view, in Afghanistan, Islam is on the religious point of view, it's almost not clearly 99.7% people are Muslims. There's a combination is 84.7 to 1015. Muslim different caste, and only 0.3% are non-Muslim. So why this corruption is very high? I mean, what do you think? How can we integrate the religious perspective into the corruption activity so that the rate should go down? What do you think? How can we go for the religious acceleration, or we can use them as a catalyst to improve the to get down the corruption rate? How can we go for it? Because this is the only hope we have that it can help us.
That's a very good point, a very good question. The solution is obviously more complex than I can offer, but I think religion helps us because at a young age, I remember in Logar or even Kabul, when I used to go to the masjid at a young age, we used to learn obviously everything in the Sapara and everything in Quran about doing the right things. The problem I think happens is when we get into the business environment, the regulation is very, very unclear, and sometimes they're not being reinforced or enforced at all. So I think religion helps us to be more ethical, to think about doing that which we want other people to do to us. So as they say, do unto others as you have them do unto you. In other words, if your neighbor is hungry, you go and share your food with your neighbor. That's what we learn at a young age, to take care of each other in the community. But when you get into adulthood, and we see, for example, sometimes you might have a good Concours score, but you don't get accepted to these universities. So you need to know somebody in order to get accepted. Sometimes that is wrong. Enforce the rules. And if we enforce the rules, I think eventually it becomes part of the culture. But your question is very valid. So what might be one of the things we could do? One of the things we could do at the government sector is to have clear rules and make the decision-making transparent. Because if I'm working for the government sector, I should not accept bribes at all. There should be zero tolerance for that. So if we make the decisions transparent based on, okay, here's why the students got accepted to the university based on their scores, and there was no wasita, there was no connection, there's no rishwatkhori. So the more we can do that, the more everybody can see that, okay, the decisions are being made based on performance and not so much on wasita. And same thing is true of position. So oftentimes when people are qualified, they don't get the position, but we don't know how the decision was made. It's not an Afghan problem, it's also in the US as well. So I see the problem of connections here also, but it's obviously here, there's more clear laws. So you can actually go to the court system and sue and ask for the data in terms of how decisions were made. In Afghanistan, that's obviously very challenging and not always possible. So I think we can make things more transparent and give the data to those stakeholders who need to see it in order for them to believe that decision was not made based on corrupt intent, but it was made based on data and evidence. But that requires so much time, so much training, and we need to invest in that in order for Afghanistan to not only be perceived by the international community as more ethical, but also for us ourselves to see that, okay, our people are making good decisions. And I think that's very possible to do that little by little. And many companies that I've worked with in Afghanistan, I think they're doing a good job of training their people, but that's a very small percentage of the workforce. We need to do that in all of Afghanistan, and also start with the education of young children at maybe 6th grade, 7th grade, and continue discussing ethics. So I think our Islamic values play a major role, and it helps us. We just need to enforce that in the work sector or in the government sector to make it into enforceable laws.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your detailed answer, sir. Is there anybody who wants to ask any question?
I see the comment from Muhammad Idris John saying that one of the biggest problems or unethical practice in Afghanistan is discrimination in workplace. So what will be effective solution for this issue? That's a very, very good question. And unfortunately, discrimination is not discussed in Afghanistan that much in the literature. When I look at Dari literature, so Pashto literature, I still read, but not, unfortunately, my Pashto is very weak now. But when I look at all the literature, we don't talk about discrimination that much. I published one short article about 10 years ago, and I posted on Facebook about discrimination. And one of my cousins mentioned that this is not applicable in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, he was saying that, he doesn't hear about discrimination, but discrimination happens in Afghanistan every single day. And unfortunately, this discrimination happens obviously not only based on ethnic differences, but it also happens based on age level, based on poverty level, based on gender, and based on religious views, even though majority of us are Muslim, but there are obviously different sectors. So in some of that, unfortunately, is used by outsiders or the foreign intervention to divide Afghanis between themselves. So you see, sometimes people are targeted simply because of their belief system or religious background, and that is totally wrong. That is discrimination. So if we don't take care of it collectively in Afghanistan, that means foreign actors can easily take advantage of that. And unfortunately, we've been losing thousands and thousands of Afghanis in these bombings, in terrorist attacks that are usually targeted toward ethnic discrimination. So we need to take care of it first ourselves in order to prevent the foreigners from basically exaggerating this problem or exacerbating it into a bigger problem for us. So I have another textbook, and I've done a lot of research on discrimination. I'll be happy to share that obviously in the future sessions. There's a lot we can do regarding discrimination. So discrimination is very different from ethics. I've been teaching discrimination actually since 1990s. I've been doing training for corporate managers here in the US, in the Bahamas, Cayman Islands, and also even in China, I did some training on diversity as well. So diversity and discrimination should be another area besides ethics that we need to talk about so people can work together and synergize. But obviously the focus of this issue was just on sustainability, ethics, and leadership. So diversity is another good topic that we need to have classes actually in the university. So hopefully the curriculums in the bachelor degree introduces a course on diversity. I know at Nova Southeastern University here, we have a master's degree about diversity education. In the undergraduate program, we have a course that I teach right now actually about managing diversity in the American workforce. It's part of our curriculum. So hopefully the curriculums in Afghanistan also add at least one course, if not a concentration about diversity, because in Afghanistan, we've always had diversity for the past 1,000 years that you can think about, but unfortunately, sometimes we allow discriminatory practice to go on thinking that this is normal, but obviously it's not normal. It only exacerbates violence, and the cycle of oppression continues for the minority groups that are unfortunately discriminated against regularly. So we need to do more on this in future classes and future sessions.
Doctor, I just want to add one very important aspect of corruption is in Pakistan. A few years back, a person conducted a research that the government, 35% Pakistani government officers, they go for the monetary corruptions or maybe different corruptions or taking bakshish in a different forms because of their spouse demand. So what do you think in Afghanistan? Do we have certain issues or not? Or do we have the family demands in government because their salaries are very down and that can be the major source of their corruptions? Even then their religion can't stop them and they will just go on with the with the statement of Khuda Bisyar Rahima. So what do you think about such issues that the corruption is going on with their family, with their combined family system demands, or maybe their, less people are working? Did you think about this issue is a valid concerns or not?
Right, and I've looked at actually about 40 or 50 countries. So about 2 decades ago, I did some research about countries that were transitioning from former Soviet Union or communist countries into mixed economies in capitalistic societies and what was happening because corruption was rising and rising very fast in those countries. So sometimes I could relate to basically why corruption was rising. They were saying that the salaries are very low. So a police officer, when he or she is being employed by the government, the salary is not enough, obviously, for them to make a living to support their family. So therefore, it's perfectly okay if they're getting 20 Afghanis from a person who violates a road, let's say, law, and instead of going to the court, they give 20 Afghanis or 50 Afghanis or 100 Afghanis to the police officer. So that's not a lot of money. But the problem with this is obviously that, you know, that police officer gets 100 Afghanis from 20 people, that becomes basically 2,000 Afghanis. And if he or she gets it from 40 people, that becomes 4,000 Afghanis in one day. So even though the salary might be very low, many people want to become police officer because they can charge 100 Afghanis from each person who violates, instead of that violation basically becoming enforced or the law becoming enforced, people continue to violate the law because they say, well, I can pay 100 Afghanis and I don't have to go to court, and it's resolved right there. So we never really eliminate the problem. We basically exacerbate the problem. This was something that I noticed, not just in Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan, I could see that when I was living there, you know, it still continues, unfortunately, but also in these other 40 or 50 that I saw, they said it is acceptable for a police officer to accept 100, let's say, Afghanis in bribe in order to support his or her family because the salaries are low. If we continue this, the salary will continue to stay low and the problem will continue to become larger and larger, and nobody actually abides by the law. So the problem never gets resolved. And my recommendation is, if you're a police officer and you don't make enough money, quit being a police officer, go and get another job. Because if you're employed by the government as a police officer, your job is to basically accept no bribes, enforce the law, and obviously do it respectfully. But if you do accept the bribe, then you become a part of this problem. So for example, when I was interviewing teachers at Kabul University back in 2005, many students were complaining that professors are not coming to class. They're only coming once a week, and then the students have to do their own work. So the professor said that, well, here's the problem. We only go once a week because they're paying us $100 a month. But if we work as an engineer, let's say outside of the university in the private sector, they're paying us $2,000 a month. So why should I go to the teaching job? If they don't want me, I don't have to teach. So it is a problem, but obviously if you're hired as a teacher, even though it's $100, you need to teach. If you don't want to teach, go someplace else, get your $2,000 salary from the private sector, but allow somebody else to teach. So eventually the teachers' jobs will go up if we take it seriously, we enforce the laws. But otherwise, the problem never gets solved and students suffer. The same thing as a police officer when they're actually expecting bribes. But you're right, it is a problem, and the government needs to have equitable salary for police officers, for teachers, because if you're working for your family, obviously $100 may not be able to buy even the wood that we need to keep our family warm for the winter time. So the government needs to increase the salaries little by little, but you and I also have to enforce the laws, not accept bribery and not pay bribery in order for the problem to go away. But I think like Russia, for example, when they were transitioning from the former strict communism country to a mixed economy back in 1990s, they went through a huge amount of corruption. And so it is sometimes, it takes about a couple of decades to overcome that, but eventually you overcome that. So if you look at Russia today, they're very, very successful. They've moved basically over the past 2 decades from being not so rich country, but today they're much more powerful, much more influential. More and more foreign businesses do go there. So hopefully in Afghanistan, same thing, more and more foreign businesses will come. We create more jobs for our young people, and then those jobs hopefully stay there. But as long as we're perceived to be corrupt, international community will not invest in Afghanistan, and that's a problem for us that will continue, unfortunately. But that's a good question. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll be in connections with each other, and we will ask you more sessions, and we will give you our student more opportunity to be in contact with you.
Certainly, and I see a comment from Halima John. Halima mentions that you know that more than 99% of Afghanistan population is Muslim, and they know that corruption is illegal, but still is high rate in Afghanistan. What do you think? What should be done in order to stop or reduce the rate? That's a very good question, Halima John. So it is a problem, even though we're Muslims, but unfortunately some things are accepted in Afghanistan. And if we don't stop it, if we don't intervene, then that culture continues. It's sort of like, unfortunately, especially in the remote parts of Afghanistan, the way things were done, let's say 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago, we still do it that way. Even the pre-Islamic times, you know, things were done a certain way, but then we became Muslims about 600-700 years ago, but still some of those practices unfortunately stayed and we accept it. And that is obviously wrong. So we need to intervene as educators or as the most educated sector of the population in Afghanistan and also in the world, because when you're a college graduate, you're going to be in the top 10 to 20% of the population in the world. In Afghanistan, obviously, probably the top 1 or 2%. So we need to intervene. We need to provide more training. The government needs to support ethics education and enforce the laws to the extent possible. And I see that Said Walijan has mentioned that corruption has less of a chance when more people recognize it as wrong. Excellent answer, good job. You know, I also see that another comment, corruption is not just making money. Several types of corruption exist actually, even in the world. That is very true in regional as well as in the rest of the world. But the main problem is discrimination. So again, I talk about discrimination a little bit. I agree. Discrimination is a huge issue in Afghanistan. So I grew up with discriminatory practices, but I think we accepted it and it shouldn't be accepted. People accept it because everybody does it. So we say it's okay, but it's not okay. And I see another comment from Walijan saying that the starting point must be the inclusion of ethics in education curriculum from primary through tertiary. Good behavior must be learned. It is not naturally occurring. That's a very powerful point, that it requires time. So when I used to do corporate training, we used to tell people we need to develop new habits. And if you look at the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Dr. Stephen Covey, he says in order to make something a habit, we need to educate people about it. We need to educate ourselves, but then we need to practice it for 30 days consecutively in order for it to become a habit. So for example, if we're drinking too much tea or too much coffee, we want to reduce this, then we need to practice reduction for 30 days. After 30 days of doing this, then it becomes a habit. So I like Said Walijan's point that we must make it a habit by learning about it, by enforcing it, and by consciously talking about it and intervening at regular times. And I also like to mention that in my book about diversity management, I have a concept called be a cultural ally. So be a cultural ally basically means you and I need to intervene when we see something wrong. When somebody is being discriminated against, we need to stop that person and say, excuse me, this practice might be discriminatory and unfair. Here's a better way of doing this. We don't need to fight with people, but we need to create education and awareness by mentioning it and by empathizing with the victim in some cases. Okay, so any other comments, concerns, questions?
Thank you very much, Professor. This is I'm from Kaardan University, and this is Abdul Khalik Khan Shinwari from our side. I'm thankful to you for your nice information, and in true form, we got so much information from you through online ways. You were the person last time I met you, and I say the same thing to you. You are the really valuable asset for Afghanistan. You are the true form of knowledge, and you are the true form of source, the motivation factor for our youngsters. Inshallah, we will be in contact with you, and we will try to learn and make the things more transparent for the existing incoming generation of Afghanistan, so that they can valuably take their efforts towards productivity rather than just going in through the destination where there's no end. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks for your nice information. Have a nice time, sir. Thank you very much from Kaardan University, overall staff, teachers, management.
Thank you very much, Shinwari Saib. I appreciate it. And as Said Walijan has mentioned, we need to obviously do more through media, and this indoctrination toward the positive side might be a good thing. So unfortunately, it requires time. But the good thing is, fortunately, you and I have been talking about this in Kaardan University, and our other leaders in Afghanistan, both in the private as well as public sector, make these opportunities available for us to talk about it. And the more we talk about it, the more it's going to cycle its practice. And so that's all. I'm proud of you all for actually having this session. Sometimes it becomes obviously very tedious and looks like we talk about the same thing over and over, nothing gets done, but actually something is happening. Think about a Chinese bamboo tree, where much of the growth is under the ground for the first 4 years, but in the 5th year, it just grows really fast in 5 to 6 weeks. And inshallah, that will happen in Afghanistan for all of us through your leadership and obviously sustainable decision making. Thank you all. Be safe and good luck. Khuda Hafiz wa Nasiratan.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you very much, sir. Allah Hafiz. Take care of yourself. Have a nice time. Allah Hafiz.